with you in person. A lot going on over here, but greetings from New York. And I just wanted to share with you all a brief reflection on why religious freedom matters to me. There are lots of reasons for all of us. There's so much we could talk about, and something I've been paying attention to very closely the last few months is something that builds on experiences that I had as a kid growing up, particularly playing sports and showing up with my turban and being told I couldn't play. And it happened more than once, and my brothers and I, on different occasions, had to sit out, had to submit petitions, had to lobby, had to protest. I mean, all sorts of issues. And I think what was most frustrating to me at the time, and still today is so frustrating to me, is in so many of these instances, these policies don't actually make any sense. Perhaps they were put into place when people weren't necessarily thinking about me or people from my community or people from other communities, and I absolutely understand that. That's how cultural normativity works. You sort of account for what you know and who you see. But now, as the world has globalized, as we are increasingly aware of our diversity, and frankly, America's religious landscape is changing so rapidly. I found it really upsetting this past year when, right here in Utah, Sikh boys who went to go play basketball were told that they couldn't because they were wearing turbans. And, it made me flash back to my own experiences as a kid growing up, and that feeling of inner conflict. You love two things. You love your faith and you love your sport, and having to choose between them for no reason. I just found that so painful personally growing up. I didn't want to have to make that choice, and it didn't make sense to me. And so when that issue came up here in Utah this past year, my ears perked up. I was really paying attention. It's been an issue particularly for Muslim girls in this country and abroad who want to wear the hijab and are told they're not allowed to. And it affects all sorts of communities. And the reality for me is sports is supposed to be something that brings people together. But in this case, it's not. It's actually dividing. And in many ways, this is actually, in my view, a very compelling starting point for how we can start dealing with issues of religious freedom, to ensure that everyone has the equal opportunity, the equal right to play what they care about, especially our kids. And so I've been really heartened that communities here in Utah have made that strong progress. Some of it led by Muslim activists, organizers, LDS folks who have been leading, including lawmakers, and that they've come together to ensure that our kids' right to play sports is protected. And they passed some legislation this year, just recently, that is going to help protect that right for our kids in schools to play their sports that they care about. And this is, in some ways, I see it as a precedent setter, something that we want to see to start happening all around the country. Right now, there are only 4 states that guarantee the right for religious minorities to play sports with their articles of faith. And I think that's so important for us to ensure that we are taking care of our kids in this way. And so it's just, sometimes in the religious freedom space, we don't get positive stories, or we're so focused on the pain points. And this is a painful one, but also there's progress. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful to see it happen in Utah. I'm grateful to see an interfaith coalition driving this change on the basis of shared values. And I'm excited to see where this movement goes from here. Take care. Thank you, and enjoy the conference.
We're grateful for Simran's comments. He's providing our bridge from Utah to the United States. So we've had a microscopic look, which maybe you felt a little bit uncomfortable during the Utah discussion. That's great. That means we're at the growth zone, and we're excited about that. Now let's shift to the United States and bring in two totally new perspectives. Let me tell you about our next panelists. Aaron Sherinian is an incredible man who's led a life of business innovation, corporate leadership, and is going to bring us two very important perspectives. The first about DE&I, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And second, he's going to expand our vision to help us understand a little bit about faith and media. What is the role of media in religious freedom? And Rabbi David Saperstein, who leads the Reformed Jewish community in the United States, he's been dubbed the most influential rabbi in the United States. He's going to provide...
Actually an interview with my mother.
There's the context. His mother and CNN, so we do have a source here. He will be sharing perspectives on coalitions, particularly political coalitions. Rabbi Saperstein was part of the office in the State Department called International Religious Freedom. And within that office, there's actually an ambassador that's designated for religious freedom work abroad. And Rabbi Saperstein served as the ambassador at large for international religious freedom, in addition to a host of other very important positions. So he's bringing now a governmental perspective to our conversation at the United States level. So with that in mind, please read their full bios. They're both incredible men in this work. Let's think about the same place we started with Utah. What is the current climate for religious freedom in the United States? And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this, starting with Aaron. Why don't you share your thoughts first?
Well, first of all, I'd like to find out how to get an interview with David's mother. That would be amazing. It's such an honor to be here with the rabbi, with you, Rachel, with the host organization. I want to say that, if I can, I'm going to answer the question, but I used to be in the U.S. Foreign Service. And so for many years, I was on the other side of the work that this host organization is doing. And this is where the work happens, right? Whether it's through the International Visitors Program or people who are coming into the country and seeing that we are more than Washington, D.C. or New York City or San Francisco. It's where those relationships really take place. So coming here today, not only am I honored to be with you both, I still don't know how I landed on this panel, but I'm taking it. I'm not going to do the imposter syndrome thing. I'm just going to take it. I love this opportunity. But I love being with people who love the fact that connections happen one by one. That's really where the hard work gets done. So maybe with that, I can answer the question. The current climate, and I'm not a policy expert, and I can't speak to political coalitions. That's why we have an expert on the panel to talk about it. But I want to talk about the other part of one by one. There are a few people who are owning a lot of the conversation. And there are a few people, some will use the verb hijacking, some will use the verb newsjacking. There are a couple of loud elements of our society that belie the fact and belittle the fact and really hide the fact that this is a vibrant and diverse conversation. Because in so many ways, the moment for freedom of belief, freedom of religion is now. In a lot of ways, this moment was built for it. We're globally connected. We know more than we ever knew. My 8-year-old knows more about these issues than I knew when I graduated from college. So in a lot of ways, our global population, our US population is ready. It should be there. But they're also only hearing a couple of things that are about, as Simran mentioned, divisiveness. He said something in his address, by the way. Did you hear what he said? You can only work on what you see and what you know. And I'll talk later on about that see portion. My worry is that there's a few people who are controlling what we see on the issue. There are policy experts, some of them are in that, but then there are other people who don't have an interest in freedom. They have an interest in sensationalism when it comes to the freedom of religion or belief. So I think we're in a moment right now in the United States where it's full of potential and fraught with peril.
Yeah, and you've touched on a couple of important parts of that climate. So the first is messaging, right? There is a divide between the people who are constructing the message and those who are receiving it. We're going to come back to that. You've touched on the political divide and that divisiveness, particularly in a country where there's a two-party system. Tension was built into our Constitution. We have to acknowledge that, but we also have to learn how to live in that tension. And some of these other divides, the divides between information, right? Information is power, so let's circle back to that as well. David, what would you add? Where are we at? What's the climate in the United States?
So give me a few minutes to respond to that. First, let me explain a little bit more about who I am and what I bring to this conversation, because I was truly honored to serve as the U.S. Ambassador for Religious Freedom, but we're focused on the domestic front in this conversation right now. So I spent 40 years representing the largest segment of American Jewry in Washington, D.C., where there are about 40 national faith groups and denominations who have full-time representatives who serve as lobbyists, as advocates on behalf of the public policy positions that they take. And I did that for the largest segment of the American Jewish community, as I said. In the United States, unlike anywhere else in the world, where the Orthodox, the most traditional segment of the community is the largest, in the United States, it's the liberal, the theologically liberal, and most politically liberal of the religious segments of the community that is a denomination that dominates here in North America. So, and we were one of the very first to come out in favor of gay rights, gay civil rights in America. We were the first to allow gay congregations into our denomination. One of the first to talk about, to endorse gay marriage here, but we have staunchly also been champions of religious freedom internationally and domestically as well here. So we kind of represent some of the both opportunities and tensions that you have alluded to. And I want to spend a few minutes descriptively talking about where we are in America right now. So first, let's just understand that the number of Christians in America has dropped from 90% in 1990 to 67% today. And white Christians, that was 72% of the population in 1990, is only 42% of the population in the United States today. Christians of color, meaning African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, are 25% of the country today. The unaffiliated, the so-called none of the above, the nuns, according to Pew's research, are 27%. So when Simran was talking about the changing pattern of American life, this is the kind of backdrop that we have to be concerned about. And there have been three sweeping changes in the last generation that are absolutely relevant to this. One is the hyper-partisanization and litigiousness of American life alluded to in the earlier conversation here, in which there are demonstrable differences in the religious freedom realm that used to enjoy, both in terms of legislation, such as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the early 90s, that enjoyed overwhelming support across the political and religious spectrum of America. Today, that is very much not the case. Secondly, we've seen the use of religious freedom to allow people to assert the right to live in accordance with their religious conscience, even if it means their conscience to discriminate against protected categories in American life. And it brings me to the third change, the change in the courts of America. in which it used to be, if you looked at the greatest champions of religious freedom, it did nothing to do with who had appointed them as president. Earl Warren, Berger, Brennan, Blackmun, Souter, they were all Republican appointees to the court. But they were as much champions of civil rights and of religious freedom as anyone else. And studies have shown, there was one major study about the decade of 1995, right after the Oregon v. Smith case, to 2005, another from 2008 to 2018, to 2015, 2006 to 2015, that showed that it didn't matter who had appointed the judges in terms of where they came out on cases that came before the Supreme Court on religious freedom. From 2015 until today, almost entirely partisan differences. And that was certainly true about all of the religious freedom cases that came up related to COVID-19. So we are seeing radical changes in the court. And the court, which had pretty much from 1940s until the 2010, had a consensus about an expansive view of religious freedom, but mostly finding for minority groups, since then has found consistently for Christian groups an expression of religious freedom. And where it took a robust view of separation of church and state, the Establishment Clause, it has really shrunk that on issues of government financial support for religious institutions, although even until today, has never supported direct government support for religious components of parochial schools or houses of worship. Here, secondly, in terms of state sponsorship of religious displays and religious exercise. And third, in the Kennedy case, here in the last term, becoming closer and closer to allowing official school prayer in our schools, but in all of these cases has not stepped over the line. It has come very close to stepping over the line in endorsing these, but not yet. But we are at the cusp of this court radically changing the constitutional configuration. So in terms of religious freedom in the United States, this is an extraordinary moment for us to be having the conversation to see, is it still possible to find common ground? Is it still possible to find the kind of compromise that the Fairness for All Act represented? Although I hope we'll talk about that later, because I think we need to have a fuller picture of what the response in the religious communities and in the civil rights communities have been to the Fairness for All Act. But is that kind of compromise still possible? And it's not clear that it is, and it's not clear what the court will do. So let me just make the final observation here. Just the last decision of this Supreme Court, the last two, one was to uphold the Voting Rights Act, which surprised everyone. And the second one, it might not have been noticed, the Native American cases that came before the court. The most recent decision, in which by a 7-2 decision, they actually upheld the right of Congress to regulate what was happening with American Indian or Native American rights here under two 1978 laws that were passed. One of the first things I worked on in my career, which was the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the Indian Child Welfare Act, both passed in '78. And the court that had a chance to really chip away at that actually said Congress does have the right to actually protect these I don't know how to best say it, but what I think are constitutionally mandated in terms of what the original intent was of the Constitution on protecting Native American rights in America. So it was a surprising case. It'll be interesting to see what it means for the other cases coming down the pike, including the affirmative action case. But we are really at a crossroads in terms of decisions having to do with religious freedom. Let's see how it affects that in our conversation.
Yeah, amazing overview. Maybe you're starting to feel like, wow, when we zoom out from Utah, there's a lot more factors at play, but that's okay. We're still going to equip you with the tools you need to navigate this. So just to review some of the key components from these first two overviews of the landscape. Religious freedom has been widely and robustly protected in the United States since the Constitution was adopted, before the Constitution when we're thinking about Native people, but there's really was a turn in the 1990s with several pieces of legislation. So if you've never heard of them, this is where you take notes. The first was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which encoded in law protections that had been put down by the court in a specific case. So the consensus was that court cases can be overturned. We better make sure that religious freedom is coming through the legislative powers, and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, overwhelmingly bipartisan, passed a result of that. The second piece of legislation, which we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but passed shortly thereafter, the International Religious Freedom Act, which put into legislative law that not only is it enough to have this in the United States, but we really need to think about this internationally. And that act is what created the Office of Ambassador at Large and some of these broader discussions, also overwhelmingly bipartisan.
And the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, that Nadine was the recent chair of that important watchdog agency as well.
Exactly. So it created the Ambassador at Large, the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom,
and the annual report on religious freedom
and an
across the
annual
globe.
report on religious freedom. So that was 1990, and now we've heard the transition that's happening. We've had a few major political changes in the last year, and in the last 10 years, and certainly in the last 20 years, and most of that has come through the courts. Religious freedom in the United States is a predominantly court-based issue. People litigate when religious freedom issues cross state lines. That's how our government is formed. But I want to come back to you, Aaron. Tell us a little bit more about the media landscape, which I think is where a lot of the courts are getting this momentum and power, maybe causing too much of the radical changes. You can speak to that. What is the relationship between media and the courts and media and religious freedom in the United States?
Well, you can't be what you can't see. We heard variations of that. And we know that it's possible to newsjack, right? You can take the media, and the media is an important institution, an important part of civil society, but there are ways that you can be the loudest within the media landscape. Now, I want to say a couple of things, because we talked about two very important acts, bases of some of the things that we all operate on. More than 30 years ago, right? In the case of, I think both, actually, if I'm doing the math right. A lot happened in the media landscape since then. Now, civil society is still strong. We still have the institutions in the United States that still stand strong. I'm not saying that anything is crumbling, but let's be honest for a minute about what changed in the media industry, both in terms of tactics, the players, and really the approach since 1990. Now, there's going to be a lot of attention on what's happening in religious freedom here because of the media, but I want to actually tell a story about the report, if I may. So I, as a pup diplomat, I mean just clueless, was in a country in Central America, and I found myself in the position of marching into a ministry of a foreign government and telling them all the things they were doing wrong as it related to religious freedom. An important thing. The report is so important. What a tool. What a great thing that was going on. I thought I was part of that. I believed in it. I had done my research, and so I march into this ministry full of vim and vinegar and probably a lot of arrogance, I'm sad to say, and marched in to tell them all the things they were doing wrong. And this vice minister, whom I love, took the opportunity to sit me down and said, I know what this démarche, or interview in Diplo speak, is about, but I'd like you to tell me first about the state of religious freedom in the United States, Aaron. He then said, wait a minute, you're a Californian. I'd like you to tell me about the state of religious freedom in California. Now, that was a constituency talking to me. He put me in my place. We had a great conversation. It wasn't cantankerous. We were able to talk about the things. And diplomacy worked. That report works. Those things work, right? But it was a 19 whatever it was reminder to me of the fact that we don't know about our own situation. And I don't know how much we talk about it. Now, the media, let's fast forward to today. We have a media landscape in which a lot of things are happening. But there has been, and I'm going to speak in generalities, not to the specific court cases or the specific acts, there is a situation in which we live. It is a deforestation of content related to faith. That is the reality. There is more media than there's ever been. Ever since these acts were passed and these processes were started, we now live in an era in which there is more media content than ever. Most of the content that is related to faith is coming from a particular source. I'll talk about that in a second, but I want to repeat what I said first. We're in a deforestation time. There is not enough coverage about the nuances of faith or of freedom of religion or of the court processes or the decisions or the diversity of the different groups that exist in the United States. There's not enough. And I'm not saying there's not enough because that's my opinion and I happen to love the issue, although I do. It's the opinion of the media consumers. Over 70% of media consumers polled have said, through a recent study, have said that there is not enough content in my newsfeed about faith. And not only that, I worry, over 70%, that the media is actively ignoring it. So they're aware that in their feeds, as they scroll, they think that the algorithm or that the media is ignoring it for some reason. We can go into those reasons later on. So that does inform how you talk about freedom of religion, about the awareness of these cases that we're talking, the awareness of the three radical shifts or changes that you just talked about. Now, that's one of the things that's going on within the media landscape and the deforestation that I talked about. But the other thing that we need to be aware of, and I mentioned it earlier, is that a majority of all of the news about faith in the United States of America right now, verging on 80% of it, do you know where it comes from? You probably guessed it. It's not the New York Times. Well, actually, I'm not even going to talk about the political spectrum. It's not the Wall Street Journal. It's not even the respected institutions. I happen to work for an organization that owns one of them here locally. It's from social. And talk about a politicized bully pulpit, 80%. So this is not a small portion. Beware of social media. A lot of the faith, a majority of the already limited faith content in our media comes from social, which doesn't need to be edited oftentimes or fact-checked and can be easily published because you're a publisher. I'm a publisher, you're a publisher, congratulations. So I say that to you because I think we need to do a reality check that in 30 plus years, we have an institution, a vital institution in civil society, the media, that has shifted. Now, I hope we'll talk about this later on because I think that freedom of religion and freedom of the press are close cousins, like first cousins that were raised in the same house, right? So when on vacations together, you know what I'm talking about, the same problems, the same challenges, and some of the same tactics. That we can talk about that later on. But I think as we talk about the state of the media right now and as it impacts these things, and my colleague here, I'm sure will talk about instances in which that media landscape can be instantly politicized and where you only are hearing one voice. We have the data to prove that. So I hope that as we talk, we can be cautious of that and cautious of the fact that the media consumers that we also should be talking about. I love the fourth chair, by the way, bravo. That was genius. But I want to talk about the other chairs too. I'm pretty sure, I'm honored to be here. I want to be a good guest. But I'm pretty sure that if I grabbed all of your phones, there wouldn't be a single TikTok on almost in nobody's phone in this room. So the majority of the largest youth population ever in the world is consuming media that those of us who are championing and trying and advocating for probably aren't even using it. So we got a problem.
David,
So yeah, let me pick up on this a little bit here. First, I hope you understand my two colleagues here. Rachel really is a courageous hero of the struggles for religious freedom that she's been engaged with. So I'm really honored to be with her. And Aaron's work in terms of faith in media, his coalition that his NGO that he has put together is really one of the most influential in this area that he's talking about. So a couple of points, minor correction or taking issue and then an affirmation of exactly what you're saying here. One is the religious, Smith v. Oregon v. Smith decision, in which the Supreme Court, without either side in the case asking them to do it, or a single justice asking a single question about it, kind of scrapped the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom, saying it isn't the same protection that freedom of speech and freedom of the press and the other First Amendment rights have. Just government can restrict it for any rational reason it wants to restrict it. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act actually was passed in 93, and the IRFA Act was passed in 99, here a number of years later, but the same general area. And the only thing I would take issue with, Aaron, is press has always done a lousy job about religion. Here, it doesn't know what to do about it. And insofar as it does it, it is driven by two things today. One is the old comment about the media in general: 1 million planes land safely, and the media doesn't report on a single one of them. One plane crashes, and the media all over the world covers it. So the media doesn't know how to deal with the ongoing extraordinary work of religion, day in and day out, making our communities better, our nation better. It doesn't talk about interfaith relations that go on everywhere in America today. There's more interfaith cooperation and dialogue and cooperation going on in America and around the globe today than at any point in human history, and the media doesn't know how to cover it whatsoever. The other thing about the media that it kind of, when it does cover it, is if you look back to the mid-20th century, the authentic religious voices were Stephen S. Wise and John Haynes Holmes and Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel and Pope John the 23rd and Jinnah's voice in Pakistan, in contrast to the religious voices then, but the image he had of Islam. Here today, there is this correlation in the way that the news media, the entertainment media covers religion, that the more fundamentalist you are, the more authentic you are. And therefore, mainstream Catholicism, with the arguable exception of Pope Francis, here mainstream, the mainline Protestant churches, the Reformed, Conservative, Jewish community, far and away the largest segments of the Jewish community, they don't make it into the press. It's only when there's conflict, the plane crashing, or when it's the fundamentalist voices that speak, because they are portrayed as the authentic ones. And we're kind of all in this battle together in trying to fix that and right it. And we need entities like Aaron's entity to really help give us the tools and the guidance and the strategies and the tactics to try and do that much better than we've done. So bless you for the work that you're doing, and the voice, Rachel, that you have put forward in Bellwether to try and bring exactly that kind of interfaith voice, that centrist voice, back to get the attention that it really deserves.
Well, I appreciate both those comments. Let's add a little nuance too. When we're talking about media, we have to remember that for the majority of our history in the United States, media was mainstream journalism. So when we hear media, we think the newspaper. That shifted in the 90s and became television media, right? Television news, that's how most people were consuming. And then shifted again in the 2010s to social media. So think about kind of all of those components, plus entertainment media, so Hollywood, plus art media. Think about studio art, think about digital art, think about Bitcoin, think about all these different areas that are bringing in a different kind of media. And let's talk a little bit about your point, David, which is the 1 million planes landing every day and it's not reported. It's not reported in the mainstream broadcasting and newspaper news, but here's where I want to provide a little nuance. It is actually reported in social media. And if we were to compare plane landings to everyday activities, I'm thinking of selfies and all of the intimate details I know about people's lives posted on social media, there are more than 1 million planes landing, and I hear about every single one of them. So this raises the question of the populace and how we have changed the media, and Aaron's earlier point, you're a publisher and you're a publisher, how we can be a different kind of voice in bridging this divide. It may not be realistic to expect newspapers at this point to cover the 1 million planes landing. But if Instagram already covers the 1 million planes and then some, that's where we can be shifting the conversation, where each one of you can be shifting the conversation and bringing your faith into a conversation about media and frankly about the courts. This goes back to the courts, right? The more we're talking about these issues in our own lives, the less likely it is to go to the Supreme Court, the less likely it is to go into these litigation situations. So let's shift from the climate, lest we paint too dismal a picture, and start talking about the bridge building. How do we build bridges in the courts? How do we build bridges with the media? How do we build bridges in the current US political climate? If you want to share either a story or example, we'll just kind of build and keep going on this.
Look, we've talked about one, which is the Fairness for All Act, and as I said, I want to respond to your question, so I don't want to comment further on it now, but I think we should return to it at some point. But I'll give you an example of what goes on. When, in the 1990s, those of us who are part of this strange bedfellow left-to-right coalition that passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, right? And we decided that we have different views over what should be the law. It included very conservative, fundamentalist religious voices that really don't like the idea of separation of church and state and wanted to tear down the wall separating church and state. And a lot of the mainline groups I alluded to before that really think that separation of church and state is created a wall that kept government out of religion and allowed religion to flourish with a diversity and strength in America unmatched anywhere in the democratic world, arguably outside of India, with all the problems that India has today. It's a democracy in which there is religious life, but far more people going regularly to worship in America, far more people here believing in God, far more people holding religious values central to life in America than any democracy that has a government-sponsored, established, endorsed, financially supported religion. There are far more, and this is the most religiously diverse country in the history of the world. Sociologists tell us there are 2,000 denominations in sects in America. And to pick up on what you said before, Aaron, I will acknowledge what you're all thinking, that 1,900 of them are in California. Here. Nonetheless, the last thing we need is, from my standpoint, is to have the government picking and choosing which kind of religions are going to be favored religions, what kind of religious prayers their government is going to endorse, what kind of Bibles, Texas, again, has another effort to post the Ten Commandments on every wall in every classroom in Texas. What is that going to do? I mean, do you remember what was posted on the wall of your classroom? And it wants to have a moment of silent prayer again in Texas. I don't know what your some moments of silence. Mine in elementary school were filled with spitballs and messages passing back and forth and whispering with each other. I once debated Jerry Falwell on national television on the Ten Commandments, and I said, whose Ten Commandments going to be? The King James Version, which is what the Texas law requires, the Douay version, the Catholic version, the Jewish version. Whose translation is it going to be? I said, if you really want to do it, put up the original Hebrew, because we know that one's right. He said, no. No one, the truth is, if our houses of worship and our families instill the values of the Ten Commandments in the hearts and minds of our children, it can be transformative in terms of their moral values. If all it is visual muzak on the walls of our classrooms, it'll do as much for morality in our classrooms as the Gideon Bibles do for morality in our motel rooms here. I mean, this is not the way to do it. And, it's these efforts now to kind of tear down the wall, I think, are really counterproductive and dangerous to religious tolerance and freedom and comedy in America. But, good people in this room may differ on that.
So bridges are tricky. And I'd like to take, I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to take an example of a bridge I saw built that I think a room like this, because you're bridge builders, that you might see it as relevant. I had a first row seat at what happened in the late 90s, early aughts around girls and women. Do you remember the Girl Effect, the Girl Up campaign? You remember all of that, right? So that didn't happen because there was one organization. There were a couple of players at the table that realized, okay, there's a moment of pivot through the three sweeping changes or the things happening, the things we needed to do. And they came together in a more loosely affiliated coalition structure. And at one point, they decided we need to change something in the supply chain. Let's just, as long as we find where it is in the supply chain, then we'll have greater freedom for this issue. And they talked about it as freedom for this issue. Baloney. There's no one point in this, right? The bridge has to be built at multiple points. So what did they do? I watched this. I saw them do this. Now, one player came to the table that we haven't talked about yet. I don't think it was discussed yet today. And that was philanthropy came to the table. They realized there's not a business that's going to generate enough anything for us to kickstart this. So a couple of big names, you probably know who they are, I won't mention them, came to the table to say, okay, let's experiment. So that along the supply chain, there's a couple of things so that we can build this better relationship. So obviously I'm going to draw a connection between faith and media about what's happening. They then talked about the power at pivot points in society of words. Now, I mentioned the issue in a way, and I'm going to talk about where that happened. There was an intentional discussion to bring two sectors together. And it happened before a summit meeting in Jakarta, where people came together and said, from now on, we're going to be intentional for a year. And if we want these two opposing factions, those that care about girls and those that care about women, we're going to, instead of talking about women and girls issues, we're going to talk about girls and women's issues. So that we start treating or helping or providing funding or programs for girls so that we're not treating them for problems when they're 30, 40, 50-year-old women. Let's talk about words for a second. And that seems super fuzzy and kumbaya and nicety nice, but in an issue like freedom of religion, religious freedom and freedom of belief needs to care enough about words as these people did. And I saw them do this. They said, from now on, every sign's going to come down, every speech is going to be redacted, you are going to be, they didn't put anyone on a bad list, but they said, during this conference and henceforth for this year, we will speak of girls and women. And that mentally will signal to people that these two sectors have to come together and that we have to reorder them in order to be useful to one another. So when it comes to faith and media, I think that's where the bridge building is happening, because what has happened is it has been about faith coverage or the lack of faith coverage, or what I did earlier, talking about the deforestation of faith coverage. I did it too, guilty. I think what needs to happen is there's certain moments in the chain where we can build a couple of bridges. It's happening right now. I love some of the work that's happening from a couple of institutes and organizations, and I'd love to share with you some of this information. It starts in the newsroom. There are people in the newsroom and journalists who have said, got the figures here, but I won't bore you, I'll just tell the story. There are journalists who have said, I would do more, but I'm scared of just getting it wrong because the religious people are crazy. And so I'm scared of getting it wrong. And so if I have a choice between covering A, B, or C, or taking that to my editor, or maybe I'm the editor, I'm not going to do it. Because some of the extremist voices really crowd out the 100 planes. So number one, things are happening in the newsrooms, which is amazing. Newsrooms have shrunk. There are 400 people in America who identify as religion reporters, even if that's part of what they do. That number's tiny. So that means that everybody else needs to get some more information. Over 50% of journalists today say they don't have the training to even cover, in a semi-nuanced way, religion. That's just training. That's words. That's making sure that we're promoting the USCs and the other institutes that are out there, the Pointers and the organizations that are doing great work to train journalists, not to make them comparative religion experts, you can't do that, but at least have the basics so they're not afraid, because maybe they did not grow up understanding the differences or having a friend who was going to talk to them about Hinduism, talk to them about what it meant to be a Native American, talk to them about so maybe they didn't speak to them about cultures or religions. And the third thing, and I know the rabbi wants to say something, so I'll just say one other point in the supply chain, if I may, is that I think the other piece that people need to know about right now is that we as consumers want it. Business is business. If the people selling soap who buy the ads in the newspapers, which are now digital, knew that the consumer wanted it, they would make sure that they were advertising in places where it existed. That's not going to happen unless there's a committed group of people like us, advocates or champions, who say there's a market discrepancy. People want, it's not just Rachel Miner out there who looks for it, right? But it's Rachel Miner plus, it's at times 1,000. More people are willing to and want better coverage. So newspapers, be better businesses by making sure that you're covering it. Because they're not just doing it because it's the right thing to do. Many of them are doing it to stay in business. So I think there's a couple of points where those bridges can be built, and we need a couple of bridge builders in those spaces.
And
So
just one quick point. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, so bear with me a moment here. You ever begin to tell a joke and then forget to get to the punchline? I did that before. I was saying to you in the 1990s that even people who favored the wall separating church and state and those who wanted to tear it down got together to write guidance about what the law actually allows in schools to take place. And the goal was, based on our success with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, our goal was to minimize some of the contentious things that arise simply because principals, teachers don't know what's allowed and not allowed. I mean, kids can write on religious topics if they're given a choice of what to write on. Every kid can pray and does before a test or taking a foul shot at the foul line in the basketball game here. And kids can get together in voluntary groups and pray around the lunch table if they want. And there can be afternoon clubs that are done so long as the teachers don't run them for the students. There are all kinds of things can happen and people don't know about it. It cut the number of lawsuits significantly and avoided a lot of the sad story we heard about the teacher who wiped off the ashes and out of ignorance, and then the result of someone litigating it afterwards. Here, it gave them options of what to do about it. And as a result of that, that guidance has been reaffirmed by Republican and Democratic administrations ever since, including last week by the Biden administration. Here, it greatly cut the number of as many as we have. It would be far more if there weren't this guidance. We did that guidance for the federal workplace. We did that and what's allowed under what's required under Title VII religious accommodation. It did the same in terms of prisons and what's permitted and required in prisons. And we did it through this strange bedfellow covenant. So that's an example that you're talking about that really made a significant difference, even though in every one of those for schools, the workplaces of America, and prisons in America, particularly state prisons in America, we still have lots of challenges and problems here. But it really did help and make a difference and modeled in the federal system for some states who wanted to pick that up and take the best practices in their own state system.
Yeah, I want to touch on both of these. First, David, if we're trying to find this guidance, does it have a formal name? How would we find this particular model? Was there a clause or a title to this coalition?
Oh, there was, but the question is, it then was adopted by the Department of Education, it was adopted by the Bureau of Prisons, it was adopted by the EEOC, et cetera. So for the education ones, simply just here Google Biden guidelines of religion in schools, and what the renewal of the latest version of this will pop up immediately, I'm sure. And these are guidance issued by the Department of Education. It should be pretty easy to
Great.
find.
So the Biden guidelines for religion and education, that's another resource. Aaron, let's talk a little bit about these different points. Editors, journalists, feeling this fear of the unknown, but consumers wanting more religion in media, wanting more religious and freedom in media.
I got to ask, you looked it up. Is it there? Did you find it?
Okay, it came up.
We
Great,
live in an
perfect.
amazing age, right? The internet age is an amazing place.
If I'm a media consumer,
Yeah.
how do I contact journalists? How do I signal to editors that I want more religious coverage? How do I maintain independence of the press, but also exercise my religious freedom by saying, excuse me, there's a market and we want more of this. What does that
Good point.
relationship
Well,
look like?
Well, clearly we know that some people are. Because again, the reactions, and I'm not apologizing, and I am not a journalist. I work with a lot, I love them. But what we know is that a lot of them are reaching out. They have that ability. You have that ability, right? And people are utilizing it. But as we all know with many issues, you need to signal 99 planes, please, right? Or this was interesting for me, or let's talk about this. Now, coalitions and groups like yours, and all of you are part of networks of networks, that's where we need to take the data that says consumers want more of it and be a megaphone. Because we could do it all we wanted, one by one all day, and we'd not get there. That's where you do need a megaphone, a coalition of organizations. They can be faith-based organizations, they can be civil rights organizations, they can be parts of civil society saying, are you seeing the signal? Because there is data, real data, and some philanthropists help us do real data, not just a survey monkey of 10 people and a couple of my friends. Global data, robust, that says there's real consumer appetite. But there's another piece of this puzzle, and in the rule of nothing about them without them, I talked a lot about journalists without saying what they said the problem was in the supply chain, because they did. And we surveyed many, many journalists globally that came up with one through line that surprised me a bit. Because I've been on the other side of it, I guess I helped cause this problem. They said, that's fine and dandy that the coverage is not what it could or should be to inform a populace that can make the right decisions and talk to their elected officials, and so the courts can be informed, et cetera, et cetera. They said, our problem is you don't give us a plurality or a diversity of spokespeople. We call the institution, and we get the institution. I'll tell you a story. So I used to run communications for another faith group. I won't mention the name specifically here. Loved this group. I ran 17 million of adherents of a wonderful faith community worldwide. And I will never forget being on the line with one of their mid-level leaders where we had a press inquiry, and I had 2 cell phones. And I was on the phone with this one, and I had the journalist on the other. And this person whom I love, great, wise person in this faith community, said, well, Aaron, I really want you to look at this in millennial terms. And on the other line, live, I had the journalist saying, I have a 3 p.m. deadline. So I did have, now both were right. The journalist had a 3 p.m. deadline. The faith leader was asking me as the communicator, not a member of their faith, to think about it in millennial terms. So that's not unique just to faith, but faith leaders need to do this. They need to give a plurality of spokespeople, and they need to work on media timetables, which have gone from 24-hour news cycles to 2.4-minute news cycles. So I think let's own it. Let's own it as people who care about freedom of religion, that we need to, instead of bemoaning changing media tactics, we need to adapt to them so that we're better communicators. Then the consumer, the last piece I will say if we can, and I think we share, well, we know what we share. We share what makes us look good, right? None of us ever took a selfie where we didn't have our best angle, right, or published it. We share what makes us look good. We tend to share things that make us look smart. I wonder if, as a community of people, the grassroots part of this ballroom, the people whom you represent and talk to, I wonder if we would do well to share and say, I learned something new here about religious freedom that I didn't know, or a faith that I didn't know about, or the nuns. Because what's happening right now is all this data is reading as follows. And you read out the data. I won't say the name of the organization because I don't want them to think that I'm speaking ill of them. I love them. Some of them dine at my dining room table. But the one big study comes out, and the headlines are like this. The nuns are coming. The nuns are coming. Nobody believes. Nobody believes. I could write the headlines for 6 days after that study comes out. What about the 83% of people who pray daily in America in different ways, with different objects, in different formats?
Including some of the nuns.
Yeah, the nuns. So I think we would do well as consumers to reward when those milestone moments come out in our community or people who care about the issue. Let's reward the stuff that's more than just that one. It's almost been the same headline for 3 years, guys.
Yeah, I actually went to that institution we're not naming there and really took them to task on how they had led a couple of those, and it did result in their changing their next thing. Right. But you're absolutely right about that. So sticking with the media, in the 1990s, as a result of what I was talking about, there was a lot of assertiveness of the religious communities with media about not really covering it, and covering only the religious right, only the Jerry Fowlers and the Pat Robertsons and what they were saying and doing and stuff. And as a result, a lot of the major media, both electronic and press, actually did begin to have religion reporters for a while. Barbara Bradley at NPR and Rachel Zoll at the Associated Press, and at the New York Times and Washington Post, and, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them continued from then until now. A lot of them hit when 2008 hit, in the economic slowdown here, and then ever since the dissolution of the major media markets here because of the competition from social media. A number of them closed those down, and we're pushing more now. Again, there's a need to push more. But a couple of points, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the expert on this here. So here's what I would suggest to you about how to get more coverage. First, some of the key religious leaders should ask for a meeting for editors of newspapers. Now, you have Deseret News here, which may be the best in America in terms of covering a lot of this. That
was completely spontaneous. What just happened right now, by the way?
I really mean it. I think that and my wife, who is a journalist, really, and a very good one, and for 30 years, worked for NPR and ended up as the senior vice president for news there. She thinks Deseret News does a really superb job here. So I really mean it. But elsewhere, wherever you are, ask for a meeting. Have some of your key readers sit down with the editor. Talk about opportunities to do better coverage. Very often they want to do it, and they just don't know how to do it and what the stories will be, et cetera. If you find someone who's covering a story and you think there's a religious angle on it, call up a reporter who's written a story to say, great story. Here's something that when you do the next one on it, you may want to keep in mind. And if you do that enough, and you're providing them with good stuff, they'll use it. And then after a while, they'll begin to call you and say anything happening on it. If you cultivate those relationships, like any relational part that you alluded to before, doing that with journalists makes a difference. They're looking for things that will be different, but they don't know enough about what's going on to actually make good use of it. And you have to continue to provide it over time so that they begin to use it and rely on your judgment as to what's good for and helpful to them, et cetera. So over time, cultivating those kinds of relationships in every component. It's true with online people, with people who are influencers online. If you feed it to them, you can, they'll pick it up and use it, and after a while you develop a relationship. A lot of it is in relationships, is so much of how you change things, and it's true in dealing with the media as well.
I'm starting to think about food. We have 15 minutes left, so we're going to turn to questions. But I want to give a food analogy, if I can, to build on this. We need more salmon. What makes salmon unique? They swim upstream. So we need you to be the salmon in this scenario. When you get on your social media, you're catered a very interesting plate of options. None of them are salmon. You need to seek out the coverage of religion, religious freedom that you love, and you need to engage with it. It's not going to come on the menu. You're going to have to swim upstream. And even in our broader societies, you are going to have to seek out the coalitions, the people who think different. It's not going to come to you on a plate. That is just the reality of modern media. Algorithms are lovely, they make our lives so easy, we're validated in every way, but we need more salmon. And that is my invitation to you. Next time you find yourself zombie scrolling, which we're all guilty of, take a moment and find a new source of coverage that promotes your religious views in a positive light, promotes religion in a positive light, promotes nuns in a positive light, promotes these ideas of human dignity, freedom of religion or belief in a positive light, and deliberately engage with that. That is how we'll change the narrative. And this panel has been about the United States, but you've heard two main themes because those are really the two largest concerns. The courts, but even beyond the courts, what's happening in our everyday discussions, and what I'm going to argue is that media is really what's dictating the climate of religious freedom in the United States. Let's take that head on. Let's use the skills we have. Let's use the technology we have and be informed consumers, but most of all, be salmon. So with that, final comments on anything else you want to suggest, and then we'll immediately go to questions.
I was, none of this was pre-scripted, so I want to thank David for the comment about the Deseret News. I'm new to that company. But I was moved, and I'll share with this room, I was moved when I walked into the building and I walked past the printing press. Because every news organization has its first printing press. Every single one I've worked for, it's a tactic. But I walked by, and the person said, "Did you know Brigham Young sent back for it? Do you know the cost that it took to bring it in?" I should have known this. I can't believe I'm admitting this in a ballroom at the Little America Hotel. I assumed it came back to print Books of Mormon. It was brought back to print. The first company in the state of Utah, I'm not a Utahn, was the Deseret News.
Wow.
Because there was a correlation between if you don't have a free and independent media, you're probably going to have tarring and feathering. Now, I probably got all of that historicity wrong. I apologize. But louder, please, yes, for sure. I've never been asked to be louder. That's the first that's happening here, too. There is a correlation between freedom of media and freedom of religion. In places where you have suppressed freedom of media, you most likely have suppressed freedoms of belief. The Fund for Peace, an NGO, did an extensive research paper last year, I'm happy to tweet it out, on this issue. So what I leave us with, when we talked about those cousins, I believe that we are, as people who care about civil society and who care about freedom of religion, I think we need to stand up for freedom of expression and the freedom of the media. We are not on opposite sides of these arguments. We are probably closer aligned than we realize. So my hope would be that if we are advocating for, championing, learning about, talking with, connecting with people in this issue, I hope that we would spend as much time on the other. They're not adversarial. If anything, I think they're parallel. So that would just be one last idea that I'd leave you with. And if you ever want to go see the printing press that was sent back for so that these religious refugees could live in a place where there was a free and independent media, and it was for that purpose, I invite you.
So here would be my list of things to what the topic of this session is about how we can make a difference here. First, as the story about Fairness for All Act indicated, relationships. If you're willing to sit down with people with differing views and you're willing to work together on where there is common ground between you, sometimes not on the contentious issue, but on other things. If you're willing to socialize together, invite your families to each other's homes, work in your communities on common ground on projects you have, you build trust and understanding that allow you to transcend differences. Secondly, lift up, put a human face on the issues we're talking about. Lift up the human face of people who are forced to compromise their religious beliefs because of legislation that requires them to act in a certain way. But lift up the story of those who are being discriminated against here as well, and what that is like. Let's put a human face on this. It really changes everything when we understand the human pathos and empathize with people on different sides of it. I'm going back to the story of the wiping of the ashes here. We must teach, promote through the media, model through what we do together. We must teach conflict resolution in ways that don't result in litigation, that don't result in screaming at each other, that don't result in a winner-takes-all mentality here. And conflict resolution is vitally important here. Fourth, we need to have scholarly, real scholars who can come up with actually thoughtful ways of actually resolving things, not in the abstract, but in what the law would require. So I was honored to write the final essay in a book that came out 2 years ago called Religious Freedom, LGBT Rights, and the Prospects for Common Ground. They had 30 of the leading scholars, 30 of the key players from all kinds of different backgrounds, including the Mormon Church, including the state senator who helped shape the Utah Compromise, including an important bishop in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, but the legal scholars, including heads of LGBTQ, to really talk about common ground and compromise, which are two different things. Here. And really explore this. And as I warned in that book, if you really care about religious freedom, here in the face of the claims of the LGBTQ community to have their civil rights protected, you've got a losing battle down the road in terms of what we know the public opinion polls are about gay marriage, about gay rights in America, where the younger generation is by overwhelming numbers in favor of this. And if you care about LGBTQ rights, you got to recognize you probably lost the court in terms of the tension with religious freedom claims. If ever there was a time to find common ground and compromise, it's now. And but getting the scholarly strength and ammunition to actually do it becomes vitally important if we're going to be successful. I will say this. In the end on some of this, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. Here. In the end, where we can't find common ground, there'll be winners and losers. And that means whatever your views are, at the same time we're trying to avoid the win-lose thing, preparing for, to strengthen the position of those who feel what you think your core moral principles, as if they were balancing it out. Here, my own is, I actually believe that the schema of civil rights is absolutely indispensable to the future of America. And if we allow for religious exemptions on LGBTQ, you risk allowing it against Jews, against Mormons, against Muslims, against other minorities. Here, you risk losing the entire schema of the civil rights thing. In the Piggy case, the Supreme Court upheld striking down of religious claims to discriminate on the basis of race. Thank God it did, because if it didn't, millions of people would have made claims that they could discriminate because their religion tells them to do it. And they're Christian white supremacist nationalists today who would make that claim today if the court would uphold it. We have to think about that. On the other hand, it is absolutely just ridiculous from my standpoint that people who feel as strongly as I do about LGBTQ rights are not talking about, okay, if those rights are going to be protected, how in businesses and other, can we actually accommodate individuals who have religion or a company that has religion? And this book came up with a whole bunch of suggestions of how to do that in a way that need to be explored, some of which were not incorporated into the Fairness for All Act. There's a lot that we can do on both sides of this, but these are core principles, and in the end, if we can't find common ground and compromise, someone's going to win here. And I just believe people ought not to be discriminated against, and wherever possible, we can accommodate the religious conscience of people who may not agree with me on that. It must be done from the civil rights community as well, and I just think a better job can be done in accommodating both, even while some are going to have to live with what it means to protect the civil rights of all, even if their religious freedom has to be somewhat constrained in terms of the right to discriminate.
David, your politics are showing, and we love it. We love it. We love that right now on this panel, we are modeling where the conversation starts, not where it ends. We've raised a lot of important points. So let's go to questions. Let's take 3 questions all at the same time, and then can we kind of respond to all 3? So one here, one in the back, and one on the side. We'll take those 3 all in a row, and then we'll respond.
Should a Utah named Warren Jeffs be freed from prison in Texas because he's been denied religious freedom despite what he did to 10, 12, 14-year-old girls?
No.
First question. Okay, second question.
Sorry. See, that made it.
Hello, I'm a longtime resident of Utah. I'm a devout atheist and a militant pacifist. And it's not that easy to be that way either in Utah or in the United States because both places are steeped in religion. And we get to see that there is this polarization, and the so-called otherization is getting more and more pronounced for 2 reasons, at least. I can cite so many, but at least 2. One is this massive militarization on the, both abroad and on the domestic front. Militarization is just synonymous with otherization. We have to otherize to be able to kill them, take them as the other, and that's happening all around, so there's a divide that's seeping in. And secondly, this rise of the right-wing populism that make America white again, make America Christian again, that thing that is also taking us away from our multiple identities and making us exclusive and divided. So this massive polarization and otherization on all fronts, religious divide is just only one of them, but there are so many divides. Now, unless we look at these foundational issues, we cannot meaningfully talk about just simple religious divide.
Thank you. And the last question over here.
Hi, my family is all in Alabama, so if you hear that in my voice. So my cousin is a non-denominational pastor, and so my question kind of deals about, during the height of the pandemic, he was physically assaulted in his own church because he asked the congregation to wear masks, and people disagreed with that. And it's become something that's really pressed on a lot of members of my family that still are religious or attend church and things like that, where they have found that society or other people in their faith will not allow them to separate their religious beliefs from their political beliefs, where because he asked that, he was not a good enough pastor and he wasn't a real Christian, or because my mother is not, if she doesn't vote for someone that people think is the right Christian vote, then she can't have this Christian path. And how do people push back against distangling their religious beliefs from a political ideology, and do it especially in communities like in the South where it's very, you may lose your religious community if you do so?
I'm going to take a crack at this. You can add.
Please.
Thank you all for your questions, also from the South. I was born in Texas, so maybe that's not the South. I don't know if this is a controversial point. From Texas. Sounds like there's a lot of listening that needs to happen and a lot of talking. COVID amplified existing cleavages.
Right.
And when I hear these stories of communities of faith that are divided along public health concerns, it's because the talking and the listening didn't happen before COVID. And so it didn't happen during COVID. And those cleavages broke communities apart. And now it sounds like it's not happening after COVID. There's a really interesting kind of short-term memory loss that's happening in society where we talk about COVID like it was this thing long time ago. And yet there are still people suffering with long-term COVID issues. And it's still very much a part of our society. So do I have all the answers to this complex tension that exists? No. Is it always easy to disentangle politics from religion? No. And in fact, one of my favorite artists, Ai Weiwei, says politics is art and art is politics and politics is everywhere. Politics is fundamentally about the relationships you have with people. Every relationship has politics. So I think what needs to happen in this case is really a lot of talking and a lot of listening about what religious freedom compromises communities can create for each other and what preferences there are. And I'm not going to say that all problems resolve, as David alluded to. Sometimes we lose, sometimes we need to find a new church, sometimes we have that painful transition. But that's a transition that's allowed because of religious freedom. Think of the beauty of that, the fact that we can transition to other communities and faiths if we can't resolve those deep differences. But hopefully those deep differences can be parted to with love and kindness if they can't be resolved. Any other comments on the COVID case?
I'll take a crack. A friend from the Gulf once told me, it was in one of these what's wrong with you people kind of moments, like, you know, when you're bantering around with a friend. When you see your flag, you should see it as how great we can all disagree. It was a simple sentence, and it stuck with me, and I'm thinking about how sometimes, well, every political party talks about what it means to be American, or many, I think, do, right? But the fact that if it means something that doesn't include that ability to disagree, I think it should be challenged to make sure we talk about the diversity and the plurality. And a former boss also, since we're in a religion environment, also took me to task. It sounds like a lot of people take me to task, right? And here's, I think maybe that's the three line for you.
I don't know. I
don't know.
agree with
Take me to task.
everything you
Okay,
say.
Thank you. But it said, you fundamentally don't understand religious pluralism. Now, there's a big pluralism event happening next week, right? He said, you talk about tolerance, and maybe that's the problem with otherism in America, because we think we're good at tolerance, when what we need to be doing is being pluralistic and learning and celebrating your difference, not just tolerating it, because we have a naive understanding of tolerance. You've gotten so good at tolerating, but you still think you're better than. And so I think maybe you need to take it to the next. I don't know if that goes to the otherism question a little bit, but as you were talking about that, it dawned on me that maybe as we are, if a political ilk says that we're tolerant of other people, maybe we need to really push that definition as members of that party and say, what does that mean for us?
So first, in terms of Warren Jeff, to me the answer is no. Our fundamental rights in the First Amendment are not absolute. Every one of them can be curtailed by compelling interest of the state, narrowly applied, and that's a perfect example. You can't have a religious exemption to abusing children, allow you to abuse children, or child sacrifice, or whatever it is here. Here, in terms of your comment in the back there, I really appreciated that. This is a different moment in human history. We've always had warfare, but not the kind of warfare that could blow up the world. And if we don't get it right this time, we're in deep trouble. Here, we used to say that the house of worship was one of the few places at a time that was so divided where we were together across political differences. But now this hyper-partisanization and this litigiousness I'm talking about is affecting our houses of worship. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciated Rachel's point about our freedom gives us the right to be able to go somewhere else if we have to. But I think we ought to try to fight back, because when we can do this, we're not just doing something good in our own house of worship. We're kind of modeling the world we're trying to create. Mm-hmm. And that becomes absolutely vital for us. So I really hope we'll continue plugging at it. I do it, you know, we talked about the Fairness for All Act. There's a bill called the Equality Act that the civil rights community, gay rights community wants. And I push back against them because you know what they have in there? They try to stop anyone from making a religious claim that they ought to be exempt or accommodated under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that is as deeply problematic for me as some of the limitations on the other side. We've got to find the best on all sides of this. Are we kind of at the end, Mia, or because
And is there salmon for lunch as well, as we also want
I
to?
mean, I'd love to just tell a quick story at the end.
Tell a
if
quick
I
story,
can.
and this is the end. If you have additional questions, we're going to take them into lunch. And Felicia, do you want to give instructions on that after? Okay, last story from Rabbi Saperstein, and then instructions on lunch, maybe salmon.
So here, last night at dinner, Rachel asked us to tell stories about our formative thing. And I told a story about my own parents who traveled the world in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, most before it got to 80 countries. 80 countries. I don't know how they did it. Here, and they would bring back stories of religious communities, Jewish communities, some that were, fascinating, exotic communities, and some that were being persecuted. But they also visited other religious communities, and they were both popular speakers. So my life growing up was filled with this. And I told Alan, my dad was one of the heads of our international denomination and took me when I was 11 years old to a conference of our international body where I got to meet Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank. And he allowed us to interview him for a newspaper, our school newspaper, and it was extraordinary. But my father, in 1939, went for the first time to Palestine. He was actually shot and wounded by an Arab sniper, but remained committed to the rights of Palestinians and Jews in Israel his whole life here. But he was one of the last. He went to the World Zionist Congress in 1939, and he was one of the last to visit the glories of Central and Eastern Europe before the Holocaust destroyed 1/3 of the Jewish people. And he traveled to, it must have been July, several months before the beginning of World War II. He traveled to Gdansk, to Danzig, this city that went back and forth with Germany and Poland, where solidarity was formed here. And he wanted to see the glorious synagogue that was there. One of the most famous synagogues in the world. Beautiful, beautiful synagogue. And he came there, and it was in ruins, absolutely in ruins. And there had been a contentious pro-Nazi candidate for the mayor of the city. And he had erected a sign that still sat out front saying, "Come, dear month of May, when we will rid ourselves of the Jews." And this was the result. The only thing that stood of the synagogue was the doorway in the front without the doors and the beautiful kind of arch of that doorway on which were inscribed in Hebrew the words from the Bible, Halo Av Echad Lecholanu, Halo El Echad Bira'anu. Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Two messages, one of hatred and darkness, one of the unity of humanity and hope. Well, America has given to Jews and to most minorities, to Mormons, here more freedoms, more rights, more opportunities than we have ever known in the history of our Jewish people. This is an extraordinary country with all of the divisions and problems. I pray for the day. You're going to hear the global thing in a minute. I pray for the day when the problem of religious freedom across the globe will be how to balance out religious freedom claims and civil rights claims. There are people who are victims of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of being thrown into jail because of how they believe God or don't believe in God, who are being tortured and butchered because of those are the global problems. Keep in perspective America. But those two visions or those two messages, when we have things like this, we truly are modeling the kind of world that we're trying to create and can create. So God bless you who put this together, all of you from the Utah Global Diplomacy, from Bellwether. God bless all of you for the work that you do here. You and I together, we really can change the world.